How top American Indian warriors died. Imagine 5 legendary fighters. Some fell by a single gunshot in mist-shrouded dawn, others claimed by fever within prison walls, one laid low by a bayonet's thrust, and another silenced under a flag of truce. Today, we reveal their final, untold moments. Tecumseh was born in March 1768 along the Scioto River in Old Chillicothe, the head town of the Kispoco Shawnee. His name, Shooting Star, reflected clan tradition and his destined role. After his father, Puckashinwau, fell at Point Pleasant in 1774, Tecumseh was raised by his brother Cheeseekau, who trained him in hunting, tracking, and oratory. Early encounters with settler bands, cutting fields, burning villages, shaped his resolve to defend the Ohio country. By the late 1790s, Tecumseh had rejected the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, which ceded 2 million acres, and condemned the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne's 3 million-acre concession. Between 1798 and 1810, he rode over 5,000 miles, forging alliances among Shawnee, Miami, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Kickapoo, Creek, and Choctaw leaders. In every council fire, he insisted land belonged to all tribes and no chief could surrender it without unanimous consent. In 1794, under Blue Jacket, Tecumseh led Shawnee warriors at Fallen Timbers. The defeat and Wayne's ensuing campaign forced the Treaty of Greenville on wary chiefs. Tecumseh deemed it void, a sale made without full tribal agreement. In 1805, his brother Tenskwatawa ignited a spiritual revival at Prophetstown on the Wabash and Tippecanoe. There, amid some 6,000 wooden lodges and bark shelters, Tecumseh denounced whiskey, opposed European goods, and rallied diverse nations to his confederacy. When the War of 1812 began, Tecumseh allied with the British, commanding about 500 warriors. On August 16th, he joined Captain Dixon at Sandwich to encircle General Hull's Detroit garrison. Hull surrendered without a shot. This bloodless victory secured British control of the Old Northwest. In May 1813, Tecumseh led roughly 700 warriors at the siege of Fort Meigs near present-day Perrysburg, Ohio. His raids on supply lines and counter-rushes into the ditch disrupted American defenses. He famously intervened to halt scalping of prisoners, insisting on humane treatment even as British allies objected. Commodore Perry's victory on Lake Erie, September 10, 1813, severed British supplies. Isolated at Amherstburg, General Proctor retreated toward Moravian Town, Upper Canada, his column shielded by Tecumseh's 800 Confederates. On the morning of October 5, 1813, a heavy mist clung to the Thames banks as Tecumseh's rearguard took position beneath gnarled willows. Mounted on his gray stallion, he wore a British silver breastplate, red sash, and eagle feather headdress. Riding along the front ranks, he urged his men to hold firm. When Colonel Richard Johnson's dragoons thundered forward, a musket ball, variously credited to Johnson's pistol or an Ohio sharpshooter's rifle, pierced his right breast. Tecumseh reined in, dismounted to rally his men, then collapsed to his knees. Comrades tried to carry him to cover, but fresh volleys made aid impossible. His last breath was a soft exhale. He died upright, still gripping the reins, eyes fixed on the enemy line. Warriors draped a fallen officer's cloak over his body to conceal him before withdrawal. American troopers stripped his corpse of feathers and ornaments and claimed his scalp for a Detroit bounty. His breastplate and war shirt became prize trophies. Under cover of night, British deserters and Ojibwe scouts retrieved bone fragments, hair clippings, and his silver gorget from mud and riverbank. Colonel Johnson later paraded Tecumseh's own pipe in political tours, claiming credit for the kill. Accounts diverge on his final disposal. One eyewitness described a hasty cremation on a Canadian shore. Another speaks of settlers burying charred remains in an unmarked mound. No official record marks his grave. Proctor forwarded relics to Washington as proof the Confederacy had fallen, though scattered resistance endured. Tecumseh's exact resting place remains unknown. Osceola was born around 1804 in the canebrakes and cypress groves of the Alachua region in Spanish Florida. Recorded by settlers as Billy Powell, he bore the Seminole name Osceola, Black Drink Cry, after the ritual holly infusion used at dawn ceremonies. His mother was Upper Creek, his father a mixed-race settler. In Seminole villages, Creek Miccosukee, Black Seminole, and runaway slave families coexisted. From childhood, he learned to read the swamps, the drip of dew from live oaks, the hush of marshland at dusk, and the warning calls of hawks overhead. By the early 1830s, U.S. policy had shifted from negotiation to forcible removal. The 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing promised relocation west of the Mississippi, though only a handful of chiefs signed. Osceola refused to attend exploratory delegations, rejected the treaty outright, and began rallying young warriors along tangled trails between lakes Okeechobee and Tehopekaliga. He argued that Seminole land was a communal trust, not a commodity to be ceded by a minority of leaders. Tensions exploded on December 28, 1835. Major Francis L. Dade's column of 110 soldiers marched from Fort Brooke into the heart of Seminole territory. At dawn, Osceola led roughly 70 warriors hidden among sabal palms and sawgrass. He timed his assault, so the first volley shattered the formation before they could form ranks. Within minutes, Dade lay dead and most of his men were down. Although Osceola seldom led frontal charges afterward, this ambush marked him as both strategist and symbol of Seminole resistance. Over the next 18 months, Osceola directed a campaign of guerrilla warfare. He struck forts and supply lines, Fort Drane, Fort King, and patrol boats on the Manatee River, then vanished into hammocks and hidden bays. He forbade attacks on women and children and even ordered his men to rescue drowning U.S. soldiers after a skirmish at the Withlacoochee. His mastery of kayak routes and tidal creeks allowed Seminole bands to evade large detachments for months, frustrating Army commanders accustomed to open-field engagements. In September 1837, under a provisional truce arranged by Colonel William S. Harney, Osceola agreed to meet under a white flag at Fort Peyton in St. Augustine. Unarmed and wearing ceremonial grass skirts, he arrived at dawn on October 21st, trusting the promise of safety. Instead, Lieutenant Peyton's soldiers seized him and 25 companions. Within days, Osceola was loaded onto the USS Malabar and sent to Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, a remote prison where marsh breezes carried relentless insects and damp salt air. At Fort Moultrie, Osceola endured dank, mosquito-infested barracks and meager rations of salt pork and rancid cornmeal. Guards shackled his wrists each night. Barred windows overlooked tidal marsh where no-see-ums swarmed at sunset. He kept a pocket Bible and scribbled notes in Creek script on cloth scraps, but the moldy dampness and constant bites wore on his health. By mid-January, he suffered bone-deep chills, feverish sweats, and a hacking cough that rattled his lungs. In the pre-dawn hours of January 30th, 1838, Dr. Thomas Boyd recorded that Osceola's pulse was irregular and fluttering, his skin mottled by sweat. He had bronchial inflammation complicated by dysentery. Shivering fits alternated with delirious visions of flickering campfires and war cries. Around 4:15 a.m., an orderly found him motionless, head lolling to one side, lips parted as if calling for aid. The surgeon pronounced death by malarial fever complicated by internal infection. 3 days later, Marines rowed his oak coffin across Charleston Harbor to St. Philip's Churchyard. No Seminole attended his burial beneath live oaks. No stone marks the grave. His death in captivity, under chains and far from home, underscored the betrayal of truce terms and became notorious in both Seminole lore and contemporary newspapers. Black Hawk was born about 1767 in Saukanook, the Great Sauk village on the west bank of the Mississippi near today's Rock Island, Illinois. From boyhood, he hunted the prairies and learned from his father, the warrior White Breast, how to track deer through tall grasses and read the river's currents. The Sauk and Meskwaki peoples lived in semi-permanent villages linked by canoe routes from the upper Mississippi into the Illinois and Wisconsin woodlands. French traders called the region the Basin, where grand rivers met in broad floodplains rich with wild rice and catfish. In 1804, when U.S. commissioners secured a treaty at St. Louis ceding Sauk lands east of the Mississippi, signed by just a handful of chiefs, Black Hawk was still a minor. He ignored its terms, refusing to recognize any sale made without full tribal consent. As he matured, he earned fame in the Northwest Indian War, 1812 to 1814, fighting alongside Tecumseh's Confederacy in a series of raids on American forts and supply lines. He witnessed the brutal aftermath of battles like Tippecanoe, 1811, and Fort Dearborn, 1812, learning that U.S. expansion would not be checked by treaties alone. By the 1820s, settlers pressed the Mississippi's west bank, and the Sauk were restricted to small bison hunts on the Iowa prairies. Black Hawk, now a recognized civil and war leader, led ritual dances invoking the sacred Fox River as a boundary no stranger might cross. But in April 1832, convinced by visions that the Great Spirit would favor a return east, he and about 900 followers, old men, warriors, women, and children, slipped across the ice from Iowa into Illinois, intent on reclaiming ancestral fields around Prophetstown. The ensuing Black Hawk War was brief but savage. U.S. militias and regular troops swarmed from Wisconsin Territory and northern Illinois to intercept the British Band, as settlers called them. On May 14th at Stillman's Run, militia panic turned a small Sauk force into fleeing lines. Weeks later, at Wisconsin's Bad Axe River, U.S. gunboats bombarded Black Hawk's people as they waded upstream, trying to escape. Hundreds died. Only a few survivors reached Iowa's western marshes. Black Hawk himself escaped across the Mississippi under cover of darkness, but surrendered at Prairie du Chien on August 27, 1832. Held briefly in St. Louis, he was taken on a publicity tour up the Missouri River, shaking hands with President Jackson and congressmen curious to see the Crimson Warrior. Yet the long journey drained him. He suffered from rheumatism and the constant aches of untreated wounds picked up during skirmishes. Released in the spring of 1833 on the condition he never again set foot in Illinois, he returned to the desiccated prairies of Iowa, where his people eked out a living by fishing and wild rice gathering. Over the next 5 years, Black Hawk's body weakened under the strain of displacement. Winter frosts crept earlier and summers grew drier. His joints stiffened, and fevers, likely malaria or influenza, laid him low each spring. By late 1838, he suffered persistent coughs and night sweats. On October 3rd, while staying at the home of a friendly trader in Davis County, Iowa, he awoke gasping for breath. Friends found him propped against a cottonwood post, skin cold and lips blue. Dr. William Williams, summoned from the nearest settlement, noted labored respiration, a rapid but feeble pulse, and extensive bronchial congestion. Lacking quinine or opiates, the doctor wrapped Black Hawk in wool blankets and applied poultices of warm bear grease and willow bark, but his strength failed. Around mid-afternoon, the warrior uttered a single word in Sauk, Nini, meaning father, then exhaled gently, sliding to the floor where the dust lay red. That evening, under a waning moon, the trader's sons dug a shallow grave on a high bank overlooking the Des Moines River's fork. There was no coffin, only buffalo robes to line the earth. A handful of Sauk and Meskwaki gathered at dawn, singing a morning chant that rose like smoke through the oaks. By sunrise, his body rested in the silent grove, marked only by a cedar stake carved with 4 arrowheads. Thus on October 3rd, 1838, Black Hawk's journey ended not with the clash of musketry, but in the quiet breath of age and illness. He died among the fragmented remnants of his nation, beneath skies his ancestors once hunted, his spirit carried on the river currents he had known all his life. Crazy Horse was born around 1840 in a teepee camp on the Grand River, in what is now western South Dakota. His Lakota name, Thaswink Whitco, his horse is Crazy, referred to a youthful feat in which he raced a beloved colt to exhaustion. From boyhood, he learned to hunt buffalo on the rolling prairie, to follow deer trails through breaks in the Badlands, and to ride with uncanny balance in the thunder of mounted war parties. His band, Oglala Lakota, roamed between the Black Hills Pine Ridges and the wide Missouri bottoms, where buffalo herds numbered in the tens of thousands before the 1860s. By his teenage years, Crazy Horse had distinguished himself as a warrior. He fought alongside his uncle, the respected Chief Bull Bear, at small skirmishes against Pawnee raiders. Then in 1866, joined a vast Lakota, Cheyenne force that ambushed and wiped out Captain William Fetterman's cavalry detachment at Lodge Trail Ridge near Fort Phil Kearny. News of that victory spread across the plains, and within a year his reputation drew other warriors to his side. Though he never accepted a formal title of chief, his counsel carried weight at council fires, and his decisions in battle earned him unshakable loyalty. When General George Crook's column marched north in the summer of 1876, Crazy Horse rode out with Sitting Bull's camp, exchanging blows at Rosebud Creek before reinforcing orders at the Little Bighorn Valley. Although he arrived too late to join in Custer's final engagement, he led a pursuit that captured government packs and horses, underscoring the Sioux's mounting resistance to white encroachment. But by spring 1877, after limbs of the Lakota were starved and surrounded, the U.S. Army offered amnesty to those who would surrender. On May 6th, Crazy Horse slipped into the Red Cloud Agency, bringing his band in to live under Army escort. Rather than receiving freedom, he found his people confined to a fenced corral and subject to the Army's strict orders. In August, rumors circulated that he planned to slip away to winter camps in the Powder River country. On September 4th, authorities decided to remove him to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, for safekeeping. He was housed in a small guardhouse cabin on the parade ground, guarded by 10 soldiers and 2 non-commissioned officers. Although officers assured him he was free to go, a written order declared him under arrest. The next morning, September 5th, 1877, soldiers entered the cabin to search for hidden weapons. Accounts differ. Some say they found a knife beneath his blanket. Others claim they planted the weapon. When the guards demanded he surrender the blade, Crazy Horse rose and stepped toward the door. Suddenly, Private William Gentles lunged forward and plunged his bayonet into Crazy Horse's right lung. He staggered past the threshold, blood staining the floorboards, and collapsed against the doorframe. As his comrades tried to lift him, officers shouted for silence. He gasped once. Witnesses recall his final words simply as "Uangsi Makaya, my friend," then lay still. Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, the agency physician called moments later, probed the wound and found the bayonet had pierced a lung and lacerated the diaphragm. Without the benefit of an operating theater or anesthesia, he administered a weak dose of morphine and applied compresses to staunch bleeding, but internal injury proved fatal. At 2:55 p.m., barely an hour after the stabbing, Crazy Horse exhaled his last breath. His body was carried to Fort Robinson's Post Cemetery, buried in an unmarked grave beneath a cottonwood sapling. The Army ordered no ceremony. Lakota mourners were kept at a distance. In that guardhouse cabin, once a place of rough hospitality, he met his end not as the victorious war leader he had been, but as a prisoner resisting confinement. The precise location of the cabin faded with time, and in 1878 the post was abandoned. Today, no marker notes the spot where his life was cut short. Only the memory of a warrior whose final stand came not on a battlefield of his choosing, but inside the walls of a fort where he thought himself secure. Sitting Bull was born around 1831 to 1837 into the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota on the Grand River, in the rolling grasslands that fringe what is now North and South Dakota. As a boy, he learned to hunt buffalo across the broad prairie, tracking herds with his father, and to read storms rising over the buttes. His earliest name, Slow, Whistling Wind, gave way to Tatanka, Buffalo Bull who sits down, after a vision during a sun dance in his teens, when he lay unmoving for days in a ceremonial lodge and returned to tell of a great buffalo spirit promising him power to protect his people. In the 1850s and 60s, as white hunters and settlers poured onto the plains, Sitting Bull's reputation grew. He refused annuity rations and treaty councils that ceded hunting grounds at Fort Laramie in 1868 and again in 1876. Instead, he led his band from camp to camp, from the Missouri River breaks to the Powder River country of Wyoming, joining Sioux and Cheyenne warriors in raids on supply trains and army posts. His calm, deliberate counsel carried weight even though he held no formal title of chief. By spring 1876, Sitting Bull had gathered a large encampment on the Little Bighorn River. Although he missed the battle itself, having injured his thumb and sent his warriors under Crazy Horse, hundreds of lodges under his aegis celebrated the defeat of Custer's 7th Cavalry. In the brutal winter that followed, his people scattered to seek buffalo, suffering hunger and cold under relentless army pursuit. In July 1877, starving bands surrendered at Fort Yates. Sitting Bull led his followers into 2 years of imprisonment at Fort Randall, South Dakota, then Fort Yates, forced to depend on military rations. Released in 1881, he moved with his family to the Standing Rock Reservation on the North Dakota-South Dakota border. He refused to farm allotments, preferring a wanderer's life, and his camp remained a magnet for Sioux resisting assimilation. In late 1889, rumors of the ghost dance swept the reservation. When Indian service agents reported that prophetic dances would spark an uprising, the U.S. Commissioner decided to remove Sitting Bull for his safety. On the morning of December 15, 1890, Agent James McLaughlin dispatched Indian police to arrest him at his cabin near Fort Yates. After they entered, witnesses heard a struggle. Sitting Bull stood clutching a pistol given him by Buffalo Bill, declaring, "I will die here." In the scuffle, Police Corporal Red Tomahawk leveled his rifle and fired a single shot into Sitting Bull's chest. He collapsed backward against the doorframe, his medicine bundle, stained with blood, falling to the floor. 2 policemen were killed in the melee. Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy reached him moments later and found the bullet had pierced a lung and damaged the liver. With no chance for surgery, he administered morphine and warmth, but Sitting Bull lay silent, exhaling his last breath just after noon. Indian police dragged his body from the cabin and carried it to a low knoll by the Missouri's west bank, where a few Lakota Klansmen buried him at dusk beneath a simple cover of earth. No marker, no ceremony beyond whispered Sioux prayers.